You know, when we talk about budget cuts, the math seems pretty straightforward, right? Spend less, save more. Simple. But what if that simple math is, well, just wrong? Recent reforms to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, are a perfect example. So let's get into it, because the real numbers here tell a story that goes way beyond the initial savings.
It all kicks off with this really counterintuitive question. I mean, if you cut $1 from a government program, you save a dollar. That's just common sense. But the research we're digging into today shows it's not nearly that simple. It really makes you wonder.
How on earth can that single $1 cut end up costing society as much as $20 down the road? I know, it sounds totally impossible, but that's the core finding we're going to unpack today. This isn't some accounting mistake. It's a story about consequences, ones that ripple out over years and even decades.
So how does this crazy math actually work? Well, it all comes down to these long-term consequences, especially when we look at the group that's most affected by these changes: children. And this is where the story of that $1 begins its journey to becoming 20.
First, let's just get our heads around the sheer scale of this. 40%. That's nearly half of every single person who gets food assistance. We're not talking about a small group here. This is a huge number of kids whose entire future is on the line. So when you reduce benefits, you're not just tweaking a family's grocery budget for the week. You are fundamentally changing the entire trajectory of a child's life.
And here's the absolute key. These costs, they're not immediate. They don't pop up on next year's budget report. No, they build up over time. Think of it like a negative investment. A small cut in nutrition and stability during childhood snowballs into much, much bigger and more expensive problems later on. So let's take a look at what those problems actually are.
The single biggest projected cost comes from something we all care about: our health. See, less access to good, consistent food in childhood is directly tied to worse health outcomes and even shorter lives in adulthood. And the price tag that society pays for that? It's staggering. Over $174 billion. Next up, you've got all of this lost economic potential. A child who's food insecure is less likely to do well in school, and later on, they're less likely to reach their full earning potential as an adult. All that lost productivity, those paychecks that are never earned, that adds up to another $69 billion in costs to society.
The data also shows a really strong connection between food insecurity in childhood and future crime rates. And this creates yet another hidden cost: more spending on the criminal justice system and all the related societal costs of crime. That's another $51 billion that society ends up paying for.
And the costs just keep on cascading from there. We see billions lost in future tax payments because of lower earnings. Billions more spent on immediate needs, like more child health care and child protection services. It's a true domino effect, where a cut in one single area creates new and often more expensive needs in a dozen others.
But these costs don't just hit individuals over a lifetime, they hit entire communities right now. Because when families have less money to spend, it's not just their own kitchen table that feels it. The economic engine of their whole town can start to sputter, and this is especially true in rural America.
There's this really cool idea in economics called the multiplier effect, and it's incredibly powerful. For every single dollar of SNAP benefits that gets spent, it generates up to $1.80 in local economic activity. That money doesn't just vanish. It goes straight to the local grocery store, which then uses it to pay its employees, who then spend their money at other local businesses. It's a direct, immediate stimulus for the local economy.
So you gotta ask, right? What happens when you suddenly yank that stimulus away? For a small business, and especially a grocery store in a small town, that predictable flow of money is an absolute lifeline.
And here's the chain reaction that happens. In a lot of rural towns, the local grocer is the only place to buy food, and they depend heavily on SNAP customers. When that money dries up, they struggle, or worse, they shut down for good. That not only creates a food desert for everyone, but it also shrinks the local tax base, meaning less money for schools, for roads, for first responders. And this is not some theoretical problem. 77% of high-need counties with poor food access are rural.
That stalling engine doesn't just hurt local businesses. It puts a huge new weight on the shoulders of state governments. Because the recent reforms didn't just cut benefits, they totally changed who has to foot the bill for running the program.
And just look at how the math has been completely flipped on its head here. It used to be a pretty simple 50-50 split. The federal government and the states shared the administrative costs equally. Well, now, the federal share has been slashed in half, down to just 25%. That forces states and counties to pick up the other 75%. That is a massive shift of the burden.
To make this feel a little more real, let's just look at one state, Maryland. This policy change means they now have to find an extra $57.5 million every single year just to manage the program. That's money that has to come from somewhere, forcing really tough choices between raising taxes or cutting other vital services.
Okay, so beyond all the dollars and cents, there's a huge human cost. And it comes from this deep mismatch between the rules on paper and the reality people face on the ground. The reforms expanded work requirements, but they just didn't seem to account for the very real barriers that exist in rural America.
You know, a rule that says work 80 hours a month might sound simple if you live in a city, but in a rural area, that can be nearly impossible. Jobs are harder to come by, public transportation is often non-existent, and the number of childcare centers has been shrinking for years. Not to mention, many people are already working part-time or are full-time caregivers for their kids or elderly parents. These aren't excuses, they're real structural barriers. And this is really the bottom line. Under this new system, a lot of families are losing their food assistance not because they suddenly got a great job, but because they literally cannot navigate the logistical maze to comply with the rules. Their need for help is still there, the support just isn't.
So, let's bring this all together. When you start to look beyond that simple line item in a budget, a completely different picture of what cost really means starts to emerge. It's not just about the dollars we save today. It's about the much, much larger price we all end up paying tomorrow.
So we end right back where we started, with this incredible finding that $1 in lost benefits doesn't just disappear, it multiplies. It multiplies into future costs for our healthcare system, for our justice system, for lost economic potential, and for state and local governments that are already stretched thin. This one sentence really captures the entire hidden story.
Which really leaves us with one final big question to think about. When our leaders sit down to write a budget, what exactly are they counting? Are they only looking at the immediate savings on a spreadsheet? Or are they accounting for these massive long-term real-world costs to our communities, our economy, and especially our kids? It's definitely something to chew on.